Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. We will kick off. We're going to have a few more people joining shortly, hopefully. But today, we're going to be talking about the Rings of Fire report that the BASIS produced a few weeks ago. Okay, I'm going to start again. Some of you had to see my mouth moving and realise I was still on mute. So apologies for that. That's a big mistake of the morning, or the afternoon, rather. So by way of introduction, my name's, for those of you who don't know me, my name's Russell Seymour. I'm the Chief Executive of BASIS, the British Association for Sustainable Sport. And I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Mike Tipton to this afternoon's webinar, which is primarily talking about the Rings of Fire report that BASIS produced a few weeks ago, which really is looking at the impacts of extreme heat on athletes with a particular focus on the Tokyo Olympics. And of course, we're within the Olympics now. And in amongst the successes every country is having, but the UK is having really good success at the moment, there's already been impacts from heat. And these actually reflect climate change in general and what's happening in the world. In the news just over the last few weeks, we've seen the extreme heat in North America with that heat bubble over Canada, making temperatures up to 49 degrees centigrade. The floods in Germany with the associated deaths that were connected there. But these aren't isolated. There are wildfires going on in Spain at the moment, floods in China, floods in Russia. So these things are happening all over the world. Siberia has just been experiencing 38 degrees centigrade heat, and that's increasing the release of methane from permafrost. So all these feedback loops are starting to happen, and it's showing that the predictions that scientists have made around climate are actually happening. They're impacting society and they are impacting sport. So there's a clear necessity for governments, for society in general, but there's an opportunity for sport to respond to this as well. And there's been a real beginning of a recognition of this within sport and within the sport media moving forward. And we're going to contribute to that today. But a month or two back, we had on the BBC Sport website, we had the BBC Sport 2050 coverage, looking backwards from 2050 as to where we think sport might actually be. And Sky have started their Summer of Sustainability in Sport, where they're actually reporting from some of the sports venues and talking about the sustainability issues as well. At BASIS, we're contributing to this just over the last few months. Our membership has more than doubled, and we're grateful to all of our members and those of you, particularly those of you here today, who are new members as well. And we've got many more governing bodies actually joining as well, so hoping to influence a bit more. Final thing I'll say before I hand over to Dom, who's going to lead the conversation with Professor Tipton. We've got our award ceremony coming up in October. It's actually the 10th anniversary for BASIS. We launched 10 years ago in October 2011. And as part of that, we're going to have an award ceremony. So please send in your entries. It doesn't necessarily have to be about you and your organisation. You can nominate others if you want to, nominate organisations, nominate individuals. We've left it open. We don't have specific categories at the moment. What we want to do is recognise good practice in sustainability within sport. So either nominate yourselves, your own organisations, or nominate others. It's free to enter, free to nominate somebody. And for those who are shortlisted, it will be a free event that's going to be hosted at the Oval Cricket Ground, the Kia Oval Cricket Ground, on the 19th of October, where hopefully there will be no more COVID issues and the event can go ahead. So I'm going to hand over directly to Dom and look forward to this afternoon's webinar. Over to you, Dom.
Thanks, Russ. Hi, everybody. Just want to welcome Professor Mike Tipton, first of all. Mike is a world-leading expert in his field, which is the impact of temperature on human performance. He's worked with some fascinating people at the Extreme Environments Laboratory at Portsmouth University, which we've been lucky enough to visit, actually, before COVID. And we're lucky enough to have worked with Mike for quite a while now. His work underpinned the Hit for Six report that made a big impact within cricket, and his work was taken forward in the Rings of Fire report that we published a couple of months ago, looking at how heat and cooling strategies and proper preparation can make the difference in the really fine margins that tip the balance at the highest levels of sport. Mike's work has sparked an awful lot of coverage and commentary. That commentary continues through the Olympics. We're in day 5 now, and as Russ said, heat's playing a really big role. It's already been described as the hottest Olympics ever. That's no surprise. Climate change is making the planet warmer, and the temperature in Tokyo is increasing at a much higher rate, probably 2 to 3 times faster than the global average. There are some reasons for that, which we can get into, but the extreme kind of impacts of that have been seen today in the tennis. Daniel Medvedev, the second seed in the men's competition, at the change of ends today, said to the umpire, "I can play, but I could die. And if I die, who's going to take responsibility?" Now, Medvedev's a pretty outspoken guy, but this isn't the first time that he's mentioned the impact of heat on his own performance. And he said it's the hottest conditions that he's ever played in. Novak Djokovic has echoed that. And in the women's quarterfinal today, Paula Badosa, the Spanish player, was taken off court in a wheelchair, having had to withdraw with heat exhaustion after the end of the first set. So this is a real problem. It's starting to impact in the Olympics. Hopefully nothing else is going to happen. But we're going to get into the issues in some detail with Mike. The chat is open. We'd love you all to take part in the discussion. We'll go as long as there are questions and as long as the discussion's ticking over. And when it comes to a natural conclusion, we'll finish the discussion, but we won't run past 3 o'clock as usual. Mike's in very high demand, so we're lucky that he's with us today. Mike, as I said, you're a real leader in your field, but the kind of relationship between your field and professional sport is in its early stages, let's say. So just for everybody on the call, as a starting point, if you can just introduce yourself and tell everybody kind of where it is that you're from and exactly what you do and how you became an expert in this field, and then we'll get into the specifics.
Yes, thanks, Dom. Thanks, Russell. Nice to meet everybody. So I'm from the Extreme Environments Laboratory at the University of Portsmouth, where we look at the selection, preparation, and protection of people going into extreme environments and the physiological and pathophysiological consequences of going into those environments. We work, about half of what we do is fairly fundamental, basic research into heat, cold, altitude, drowning, those kinds of things. And the other half is pretty applied stuff with industries, elite athletes, and the armed forces. And we work with kind of 3 elite groups, I'd say: elite athletes and sports people, elite explorers and adventurers. So somebody like Ran Fiennes is somebody who's a fairly regular visitor. And then, of course, elite military groups. And the thing that unifies them all is their attention to detail and their focus and their determination to perform at the highest level in all environments. And that, of course, is a laudable aim, but it's also a potential danger when those environments are hazardous. So I don't know if that is what you're after, Dom, but yeah, cold, wet, nasty, hot and high is the summary.
Well, it's a good start, Mike. I remember do you, as well as those people, don't you, in particular explorers, haven't you worked with people who portray those people in Hollywood films as well?
Oh, yeah, no, we've done, so yeah. We do lots of media work because, as you know, if you switch on the TV, it's either dancing, cooking, singing, or some disaster. And as I can't dance, cook, or sing, we tend to be the bit on the disaster side of things. So lots of media work, and also we've worked with groups like Balthazar Kormacor, who was the director of the Everest film. So we've had the Everest cast over to the lab, to Josh Brolin, Jake Gyllenhaal, and the rest of that cast, just to give them experience of being at altitude and being cold, in terms of their method acting preparation for that film. So yeah, as I say, lots of media interest, and obviously in the last 2 weeks, it's been absolutely crazy with the heat wave we've had in the UK, resulting in about 25 drownings where people have leapt into cold water and not appreciated that although the air temperature is high, the water temperature is still well below thermoneutral levels, about 14 or 15 degrees here. And then, of course, going straight into the Olympics, where pretty early on, we had an archer. Just remember the name, Svetlana Gombayeva, who passed out and that was just standing still doing archery. So it started pretty early, the heat problems with the Olympics.
Yeah, I think that was on Saturday or Sunday, wasn't it? So let's get into the Olympics. As I mentioned at the start, the average temperature globally has gone up about 1 degree since pre-industrial levels, but in Tokyo it's risen kind of between 2 and 3 degrees. I think it's 2.8 degrees higher than the global average, or faster than the global average. And we know that when the averages change, the extremes can change. So those incidences of extreme heat can become really significant. And at a societal level in Japan, I think that's quite a big risk because Japan has got a comparatively old population. But obviously in elite performance, it's a big issue as well. And it's not just the kind of straight temperature as understand it, but it's also the humidity and the impact, the relationship between humidity and heat, and the way that affects our ability to cool. Mike, I mean, I've just learned all this stuff from you, and it's a basic level of understanding. But the way that I've heard you talk about it before is that there's a continuum that starts with performance and goes all the way through to medical emergency in elite sport. And I wonder if you could just describe a little bit about how heat plays a role in, well, how it can kind of affect where athletes are on that continuum, and particularly on the kind of, the heat plus humidity equals the thing that you're actually really looking at, which is wet bulb measurements.
Yeah, okay. So you're absolutely right. The average increase in Tokyo, 2.86 degrees, which is coming up to 3 times the average increase since 1900. And that's because of the urban heat island effect of Tokyo, where there's been so much building there, the second largest metropolitan area in the world. And that obviously those buildings absorb and retain heat and then release it overnight. And as a consequence of which, what we call the wet bulb globe temperature, which I'll come on to in a moment, stays pretty high all day long. It's up in around about 30 to 33 degrees. Now, just bear in mind that at around about 32, many organizations recommend the cancellation of sporting events. So let me just tell you quickly about WBGT so that we can contextualize that. When we talk about the environment, we tend to talk about a temperature. It's 20 degrees, it's 30 degrees. And that's fine, but it misses quite a lot of the thermal stress of the environment. Because as people will know, if you're out, on a reasonably cold day, there's quite a difference in temperature if you stand in the sun as opposed to stand in the shade. And that's because you're getting lots of radiant heat directly from the sun. And an air temperature doesn't include that. So we then look at a globe temperature, which is essentially a normal thermometer inside a globe, a black globe that is a measure of the amount of radiant heat. And that can be up to 1,000 watts per meter squared on a hot day when the sun's straight above you. So now we've got an air temperature and we've got a globe temperature that's allowing you to assess the heat from the sun. And the final bit, which you've mentioned a few times, is humidity. It's actually water vapor pressure in the air, but we'll keep it simple by calling it humidity. Once air temperature gets above skin temperature, you start to absorb heat from the environment by convection, conduction, and radiation from the sun and heated surfaces. The only route you have to keep cool once you get into the low to mid 30s is by the evaporation of sweat. And it's not the production of sweat, it's the evaporation of it. So if you produce sweat that just drips off the body or gets absorbed into clothing and never evaporates, it does you nothing, no good whatsoever. All it does is dehydrate you. So it must evaporate. And the problem, of course, is as that water vapor pressure in the air goes up, your ability to evaporate sweat goes down. So the nightmare combination is a high environmental temperature, above 31, 32 degrees, and a high water vapor pressure or high humidity. And that's why, to some extent, a jungle is a more demanding environment where it's hot and humid than a desert that's very hot but very dry, so you can evaporate sweat. Now, this is why Tokyo is the largest challenge of the Olympics in recent years, is because of that combination of heat and humidity, and the fact that that heat and humidity is stays pretty constant throughout the whole day. So you can move an event to early in the morning, but the triathlon, as you know, went early in the morning. Water temperature was 30, which is in itself, pretty tough. Is when most elite athletes would want to be swimming in water at about 20 to 24 degrees. We've got water at 30 for that. And the air temperature was 30 and the humidity was 70 to 80. Now, just relating that back, in the Doha World Championships for the athletics in 2019, the air temperature was 32, the humidity was 70%, and 40% of the runners in the women's marathon failed to finish. So they're the kind of areas we're playing in.
So is it, I mean, you mentioned triathlon there, and, thinking about endurance events, like the cycling took place, like the men's cycling took, I think, 6.5 hours, that race, and it was in high temperatures, and I think humidity was way above 80%. Are we talking about those kind of long endurance events that are exposed?
Yeah.
Or are we talking about like different impacts in different sports and kind of what clothing people wear, and like what are the factors that create risk?
So you're talking about lots of different things, and one of your points of your previous question is about this continuum. So right at the left hand end of that continuum, let's call it, is people becoming uncomfortable, and that discomfort can impact on performance. We know that being hot affects mood, motivation, sense of fatigue. As your deep body temperature starts to go up a bit, you start to have cognitive problems. So complex decision making. If you've got a strategy you're trying to adhere to, or a game plan, that becomes more difficult. Concentration becomes more difficult. So now we're talking about events that actually don't involve you moving about a bit much, but are requiring shooting, something like shooting, archery, these kind of things we've already talked about. Something that requires concentration and high levels of focus. As your deep body temperature goes up, you then go through muscle cramps, thirst, fatigue, muscle weakness. We then get into an area where heat exhaustion can occur. Your deep body temperature doesn't have to be very high. You can just have been in the heat long enough to have sweat quite a lot, have become dehydrated, having balances in the salt concentrations in your body. That then ends up with people being heat exhausted. As core temperature goes up, you now slipped from heat exhaustion into heat stroke. And heat stroke is a medical emergency that, if it's not treated, can result in death. And in amongst all of that, people are making bad decisions. So there's this horrendous descending spiral where somebody may be exercising and they may think it's a very good idea to run off the front of an event. And what that does means they produce more heat, which then feeds back around that system. A really good example was Johnny Brownlee in the World Triathlon in Mexico. Is in the top 3, has to come in the top 3 to win the World Championships. One of the other guys in the event is his brother, who's not going to beat him for the World Championship. Gets hot, makes the decision to run off the front, gets hotter still, and came about as close as you can to heat stroke without actually getting it. But that was a medical emergency by the end of that event. So these cognitive effects and these physiological effects interact. But there is no sport that won't be impacted in some way. It may well be a thermal comfort thing that affects concentration, affects focus. As you move into the sports where you're also generating a lot of heat, so soccer, rugby, all the athletic events, then of course you can compound that discomfort and that heat load from the environment with the heat load from the body, because 80% of the energy you consume when you exercise is released as heat. We're about the same efficiency as a car engine, which I always find a bit depressing, because it means when I put 100 pounds worth of petrol in my car, about 80 pounds worth of it is going to be released as heat, and only 20 pounds worth is going to move me along. But I don't dwell on that, otherwise you get pretty depressed. So anyway, the long and short of it, where you're more likely to get to a medical emergency is where you are producing heat in those environments where you just can't offload it.
So I want to get into some policy stuff around this, which, I mean, it's really interesting. Just so you all know, we had a quick chat before the webinar in which I said that there's a high risk in conversations that I've previously had with Mike that my head explodes after a certain amount of time. And in the terms of like the understanding to exploding head continuum, I'm just like about over 60% at the moment. So we're hanging in there. But You mentioned Johnny Brownlee. I want to come to that in a second, but just interesting actually hearing you say that, because watching the cycling on over the weekend, and first of all, I've never seen so many riders cramping with, like with 40, 50 kilometers to go. And I was wondering what role heat played in that, or whether it was just kind of, like fatigue, because most of them had been riding the Tour de France over the last 2 or 3 weeks. But also Mark Cavendish in commentary, he said that he considered heat to be a big factor in Geraint Thomas's crash, partly because of the way that heat affects the decisions that you make and your ability to react. So that would back up what you were saying. And I remember when we were doing the Hit for Six report, you were talking about, the ability for batsmen to be able, or batters in cricket, to be able to make split-second decisions with a ball that's hurtling towards you at 90 miles an hour. It's really interesting. But you mentioned Johnny Brownlee there, and Johnny Brownlee came fifth in the triathlon, which was a really good. I'm sure he wanted a medal, but it was a really good result for him. But he must have done an awful lot of work, given his history with competing in conditions like this, to make sure that he was in the best possible condition to perform, and to perform safely in Tokyo. Do you have a decent insight into kind of how he went about that?
Yeah. So we were consulting with the English Institute of Sport for the last couple of years, and I have to say that one of the things that the concern over Tokyo in terms of its temperatures has provoked has been, for the first time, I think the thermal challenge of these environments has been taken really seriously. Historically, when you were preparing for athletic competition, people always worried about training and your training program, and you couldn't mess around with your training program to worry about the thermal, that would interrupt with the training program, and they would worry about nutrition, and the temperature or the altitude or whatever it was kind of just ignored until a couple of weeks before, when they might go and do a bit of acclimatization. But of course, the problem with that is your performance may deteriorate if you don't train ideally, or if you don't have ideal nutrition. But actually, your life's at risk if you get the temperature bit wrong or the altitude bit wrong. And so I was really pleased that the English Institute of Sport got in touch really early and took the preparation of the athletes for Tokyo very seriously. I was working mostly with Dr. Vic Downey, who was then set up the acclimatization tents at Bisham Abbey, and I think she was responsible for soccer, but there were other leaders within the EIS who were doing different sports, lots of different sports. Laura Needham, for example, was doing triathlon, is out in Japan now, and they actually did very comprehensive heat preparation programs, heat acclimatization programs. They also did standard heat exposures of everyone, so they got a feel where everybody was, because people vary very much in terms of their innate ability to deal with the heat. I mean, going right back into the 50s, where people were studying those working in mines, gold mines in South Africa, about 25% of the people, of the 42,000 people studied, about 25% were naturally heat tolerant, about 15% were naturally heat intolerant. And so this can even shoot through your selection policies. I mean, if you've got to go and perform in a hot environment, you want to pick the people who are heat tolerant, and then all of them, you want to get more heat tolerant by acclimatizing them. And the way you do that is you put them into a representative environment, about 100 minutes a day with exercise. After about 14 days, you'll get the physiological changes that help you perform in the heat. So you'll sweat earlier, you'll produce more sweat, but with less salt. You'll expand your blood volume, so that you've got blood is one of the functions of blood is a coolant. So you've got more blood in the body that can go to the muscles, go to the skin, keep you cool. You'll have a lower starting body temperature. You'll feel more comfortable in the heat. So your confidence in your ability to perform will be improved. And so your whole system, your cardiovascular system, your circulation, your heart, your temperature regulation system, all improve over that 14-day period. And the EIS have been doing that now for well over a year. And I think, as I say, testimony to that is that if you look at Tom Pidcock getting a gold in the cycling in a pretty, rugged endurance event, Alex Yeh, Johnny Brownlee probably doing the best he's ever done in the heat. is testimony to the fact that they took it seriously and it worked. And I suspect, although I don't know, that the Norwegians did something very similar, because for Christian Blomfeld to win that race in that way, he was obviously pretty well adjusted to heat in the triathlon.
So interesting. It's remarkable. So it takes basically our physiology to change within 14 days. That's all it takes.
Yeah, the big change is going to occur in 14 days. Then there's other things that, it's also learning how to pace yourself in the heat. Yeah. When to apply and for how long to apply bursts of energy that are going to increase your temperature, and then easing off and allow it come down a bit. So there's a whole skill in terms of pacing that goes with that. But actually quite significant physiological changes can occur in sort of 5 to 14 days. And then you have to keep it topped up. And the other thing you do is, as I say, historically, this kind of intervention was done a couple of weeks before the event. They flew to a hot place for their. The trouble with that, you don't know who acclimatizes well, who acclimatizes badly, who needs longer. Doing it a year out, going through an acclimatization process a year out, gets people used to the benefits that come from it, how long they have to acclimatize, how quickly they tail off afterwards. And it's just, you wouldn't go and put a new pair of running shoes on the week before an event. So why go and change your thermoregulatory system the week before an event? Why not have done it a year before and know how you're going to respond? Because it improves your confidence, the whole thing improves. Now, it doesn't mean the ideal temperature for endurance sports is about 11 degrees Celsius air temperature. So if you're going to go into 32, I will be amazed if we see any world records in Tokyo in the endurance events. What we're trying to do with all of these interventions, and I've only really spoken about acclimatization, the major one, is try to minimize the decrement in performance. So, you might expect a 10 to 15% decrement in performance. With acclimatization, you can minimize that. But like I say, at the same time, you're looking at clothing design, you're looking at rehydration strategies, hydration strategies, pacing strategies, all the kinds of things you would do, air conditioned rooms at night to make sure you get a good night's sleep. It's a pretty comprehensive package that you have to put in place.
That's interesting that about, I guess we're not going to see so many personal bests or world records. It's about mitigating the decline to keep it as close to that as is possible to be. It's been a hallmark, actually, these games so far, that it's been about the race and the competition rather than it's been about the clock in a lot of events. And that's true. I mean, I guess for different reasons, but that's been true in the swimming as well, because they flip the program. So the finals are first thing and normally people swim faster in the evening. I wonder if, obviously everybody, if there's anything that has been said so far that you want to pick up on or comment on or ask about, then just drop it in the chat and we'll bring you in. But I wonder if we can just move on to the tennis and what we've seen and the implications of what we've seen in the tennis. There are actually a few people on the call who work in tennis who might be particularly interested in this. So we've seen somebody have to withdraw because of the heat. We've seen some of the biggest names in the sport make some pretty strong comments about the heat. Djokovic has actually requested that his matches, or that the matches generally, can take place a little bit later when the temperature is cooler. But interesting, actually, because the implication of what you were saying was that isn't going to make much difference. Is that right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. If you look at there was a study done a year ago at the same time as the Olympics. So they looked at the WBGT over the course of 24 hours. And at midnight, it was 30. I'm just looking at the data now. At 3 o'clock in the morning, it was 30. At 6 o'clock in the morning, it was 30. At 9, it was 33. At 12, it was 34. At 1500 hours, at 3 o'clock, 34. At 6 o'clock, 33. And at 9 o'clock, 31. So over the 24-hour period, you only got about a 3 or 4 degree swing in WBGT. Now, actually, that actually moves it from the American College of Sports Medicine guidance, cancel an event, to don't cancel an event, or be acutely aware of the danger of exertional heat illness. But it doesn't go down to 10 or 15 degrees overnight. It's staying warm for the reasons we've mentioned. And I think tennis is really interesting. There's been lots of work done with tennis and by some of the sort of thermal physiologists in Sydney looking at interventions to try and people can see this work online. But one thing it tells you is that these guys know that they can't perform at the level they want to perform in these conditions. And I think there's a real message there for generally that the spectacle of an event, all events, is going to be diminished if you keep trying to put them on in these kinds of environments. And it's not just the athletes whose performance is going to be impaired. So is the performance of the judges, the line judges, the umpires, because heat, as I said earlier, affects all of those kind of complex decisions and vigilance. Your attention is all impacted. And finally, it's going to at least the elite athletes are incredibly fit, and if anybody's going to tolerate these kind of temperatures, they will. But somebody sitting in stands watching under these conditions is, themselves at a fairly high level of heat stress, sunburn as well. If sports fans want to watch the best spectacle they can, if they want to see people performing at the highest elite level, breaking records, then they don't need to be in a hot environment, because it just won't happen. And the game will change. The game will have to change. So tennis has changed by introducing a heat break at the after the third set, 10 minutes, which is probably of little to no use whatsoever, because the amount of cooling that will go on in that time is minimal. There's a whole range of issues come from the kind of spectacle that you'll see when you put sporting events on in hot environments. And the trouble with Tokyo is, as you alluded to, if you move it to a different time of day, it doesn't make that much difference. You may have to move it to a different place like Sapporo, which is about 6 degrees cooler, which is where the soccer and the marathons and the race walking are going to happen. But I also suspect that what's going to happen is, if we're going to go to some place, it's going to have to be a different time of year. And one of the things I'm suggesting rather mischievously at the moment is the Summer Olympics may end up becoming the Autumn Olympics.
So the 68 games in Tokyo was in October, wasn't it?
It was.
Was that the reason for it, or was there different considerations?
I think that was part of the reason for it, and that's what I couldn't really understand. Although I suspect, and I'm not an insider in terms of the deals that were, and sponsorship deals, etc., that were signed up to. But when the Tokyo Olympics had to be delayed, there seemed to be an ideal opportunity to say, well, we'll have it in October rather than go for this time of year. But they didn't. But I suspect there were other considerations other than the performance, health and safety of athletes involved in that decision.
Well, you're getting into something we've talked about quite a lot. I think we've had 13 or 14 months of webinars now since the start of the COVID lockdowns, which was the reason why we started this series. And the prioritization of commercial decisions over issues around sustainability and climate change, and in this case, obviously, athlete well-being and the quality performance, do seem to, for the most part, there are some notable exceptions. Some of them are actually represented on this call, but for the most part, still do seem to be dominant. So if you're advising the IOC, as I hope you do actually in the future, because it seems like this needs to be a big part of the decision-making process, would you almost like have a criteria for the kind of type of geography that they need to be looking at? Or, it's almost like if you want to hold it in this city, then you have to do it at a certain time of year or whatever. Yeah.
I mean, the interesting thing is, if you consider the Winter Olympics, there's no decision to be made, because there's plenty of evidence out there, as you already know, Dom, that quite a few of the previous venues for the Winter Olympics are no longer available because they just don't have snow anymore.
Yeah.
Now, okay, so that's a decision that's been made for the Winter Olympics in terms of location. With the Summer Olympics, it's going to require a different type of decision. It's not going to be an enforced decision, but it would seem eminently sensible to say, well, okay, we've got temperature data, we've got water vapor pressure data, we've got solar load data for these events, and we want to stay well clear of the recognized and internationally accepted guidelines for the warning signs of temperature and the cessation of events. So, okay, let's go to Japan, but let's make it a November Olympics. Or let's make it an October Olympics, like, as you say, it was the last time it was held there. That would be my advice. And I think you would then take out, well, you certainly improve the games as a spectacle of elite performance, but from all concerned, including the, as I say, the coaches, the support staff, the umpires, but most of all the athletes.
This is really interesting. I'm quite taken with the whole concept of the way that major global sporting events are organised at the moment. And actually, the 2026, I think it'll be, Football World Cup, that's going to be held across Mexico, the USA, and Canada. So you've got three. So conceivably, you could be having three group stage matches, one in Mexico City, one in New York, and another one in Vancouver, which is like a ridiculous geographical footprint and therefore carbon footprint. So you've got the one aspect there, but the other aspect is that the Football World Cup will coincide with the heat waves that we've seen actually in North America at the moment. There's absolutely no chance that you're going to be able to play elite competitive sport in those conditions. And these, albeit it's a different global governing body, but these decisions have obviously been made without even a second thought to the environment. And that is a fundamental thing that's going to have to change, and like very soon, because 2026, I started working in climate issues, what would it be, like about 10 years ago now, something like that. And I'm quite taken actually the last few weeks and months with this thought, and it's not a very comfortable thought, that a lot of the projections that we were seeing at the time for about 2030 are increasingly a reality right now in terms of the scale of, for example, wildfires or the impact of flooding on populations around the world. And actually 2026, so we're going to see an exponential increase in the challenges associated with the changes to the climate that are already locked in, but you're making decisions now about events that are going to be held then that still don't even take account of the reality as it is now, let alone the reality as it will be then. So what's it going to take, do you think? I mean, I know.
Well, unfortunately, Dom, I do a lot of work in all kinds of different areas, and normally it takes a disaster. If it were the provision of life jackets on ferries, it takes a disaster. It takes Estonia or Herald of Free Enterprise. I hope that it doesn't take a heat-related death in an athlete. But I worry that it does. I mean, we've already had Fran Crippen, obviously sadly dying in the open water swimming event, which brought in the rules for where you could and couldn't hold events in terms of temperature. I mean, there's a couple of things I'll just mention as an aside for those involved in that have to prepare athletes. Number one, just on that issue before you leave it, is I think sports followers around the globe should be demanding this. They're paying loads of money to these various companies to be able to see the Olympics on whatever it is, or whether it's a license fee or a fee to a TV company. And they should be saying, look, I want to see the best thing I can. And they should be lobbying to address climate change, number one, and also to make sure these events are held in places where people have a chance of performing at their best and without risk of injury. And the second thing is, I feel incredibly sorry for people who have to prepare athletes. So, I mean, just take soccer, because you mentioned soccer. I mean, our definition of a good soccer player is somebody who can play in Manchester, Liverpool, or London in the winter. And the way we therefore appraise soccer players, and it can apply to all sports, is the way we play tennis, the way we do anything. The way we appraise footballs and the strategy we employ, let's have wing backs sprinting up and down the wing to support the one centre forward we've got. You can't play like that in a heat wave. And so we're developing a game plan in Northern Europe, in the colder climates, that is just unusable. And therefore it's no surprise to me that when England do well in an event, it's held in London. We won the World Cup in 1966 and we get to the final of the Euros. But if that had been in a southern and Mediterranean state, or in where you say the next World Cup will be, or where we're going to have the next set of competitions, then you've got no chance of performing because we're selecting the wrong players and the wrong game plan for playing in a hot environment. You have to completely change the way you go about things, and we can't do that week in, week out. So, as I say, I go back to the fact that it's a real testimony to particularly the EIS to get guys who come from Yorkshire able to run a triathlon and come in the top 5 in Tokyo is an enormous achievement. You're in a large disadvantage having to go and perform in those environments.
This is really interesting. I like that notion of fans having the opportunity or the responsibility to demand that this is, I guess, more of that part of the thought process, and part of that is about the way that the quality of the competition, but also, increasingly, hopefully, the companies that sponsor these events that are, primary factors in the decision making will demand that too, not only because of the quality of competition, but also because sustainability is increasingly going to be a core value for them, and they recognise the importance of things like climate action. But just on kind of people using their voice, be it a company or an individual or whatever, one thing we have talked about in this series is the power of the athlete voice, and whether you think, because ultimately all of this comes down to climate change. I mean, heat existed in the world before, but the risks, the magnitude of the risk, the frequency of events that become risky, whether events that become risky for people in performing at that level, is massively increased by climate change. So, I mean, what role do you think athletes have got in kind of taking a stand and actually, stepping out of the core sporting sphere? I mean, climate change, global diplomacy has got its own Olympics in November in COP26, and you wonder whether given that restraining climate change it's got to be the objective for those talks, whether there's a role that sport can play to put proper pressure on governments to basically just to do more and to get us in a better position. Because as it stands, COP, in my judgment, and my judgment is kind of based on my kind of day job, which is around political considerations around COP, it's not there at the moment. The pressure isn't there. There's the negotiations, I think, are getting us to a bare minimum rather than to where we need to be, certainly around 1.5. And just whether you think sport has got the capacity to put some real pressure on the political process.
The answer is yes. We've all, as you've already mentioned, we've had some pretty preeminent sports people voicing concerns. Djokovic, Lewis Hamilton, Paula Radcliffe, Shane Warne, Mo Farah have all made comments in this area. And then I always think back to Formula One to some extent. You mentioned Lewis Hamilton, and of course one of the skills that gets affected by heat is driving, because if you get hot, that cognitive decrement that we've talked about impacts decision making, which is split second in Formula One. But if you recall it, there was an enormous driver movement to improve safety in Formula One. And it worked. I mean, obviously there were some very sad fatalities along the way, and that goes back to having to have a disaster. But this is a safety issue. I mean, we can talk about this in terms of performance, and it's really important that we do, because it does affect performance. It does affect the spectators' experience, and that's why they should be lobbying like mad. But also the athletes need to be lobbying like mad, because it's a safety issue. It's a safety issue in the same way that other safety issues have been lobbied for. So and I would call upon athletes who are being asked to go and perform in situations that we know are positively dangerous, that they should be lobbying against that, not because of a sporting function, but because it's a safety issue.
That's interesting. I mean, Lewis Hamilton, to his credit, has spoken out about these issues, and I think he is prepared to make some political statements on it. I'm generally kind of an optimistic person and like to give everyone the benefit of the doubt, but you talk about those examples of safety in Formula One, and I agree with it. Like, I agree totally with what you're saying. But that weekend at Imola, Roland Ratzenberger had died in qualifying, and they went ahead with the race. They went ahead with qualifying. They went ahead with the race. The thing that made the difference was the fact that it was Ayrton Senna who died during the race, and he was obviously a transcendent name. So I hope it doesn't come to what you said earlier about it taking something on that scale. And if it does happen, then I hope that, you know, it doesn't matter about the size of the name. It doesn't have to be a Usain Bolt scale of Olympian for it to really cut through and make a big difference. There's a comment come through from Amanda about Vancouver and the Winter Olympics and having to helicopter in snow for the venues, and I think it was the same in Sochi, the venue in Russia, because the snow conditions were really poor. I mean, everybody can see the comment, and the IOC has been in the spotlight for all of this stuff, and I know that they have kind of, I guess, renewed their commitment on sustainability. I think it remains to be seen how much of a difference that can make. But it's an interesting point about the calendar working in the way that it does, because it fits around the existing sporting calendars that's set by kind of national and international federations. And whether federations are prepared to change their calendar because of climate risk. And then the knock-on effects of that will be a different time for the Olympics. I wonder, we talked about the World Cup. I wonder whether the fact that the next FIFA World Cup is going to be in December can actually be an opportunity to start a conversation around that. Because in Qatar, obviously they're having to disrupt the whole of the football calendar in order to make that World Cup viable. So maybe there's an opportunity there.
Just if I were an elite athlete, and I have to say I'm some way from that, but if I were, I would. I mean, just setting aside the fact that I'm being asked to go and perform in what's a dangerous environment, which I think is that safety issue. I mean, you know, to train for 4 or 5 years for an event that then becomes a lottery because of the weather is something which is just, it seems to me to be unacceptable. And as you quite rightly say, I mean, it's an important point to make that humans can deal with 1, 2, 3. We do it all the time, degrees or, you know, change in air temperature. We do it between the summer and the winter. We do it, but it's the extreme environment and weather events, and it's when those temperatures start to get up above, you know, 25, 28, 30 degrees Celsius. Now, you know, whether there's cloud cover on the day can make the difference between me being able to perform and not perform. And that seems to be way too much of a lottery for somebody who's devoted 5 years of their life or 4 years of their life to an event.
Yeah, particularly in an Olympic cycle where it really is the pinnacle and it's the kind of foundation for your opportunity to build a career out of something. You do well and you can, and you don't do well and you don't really have the opportunity. You're almost starting from scratch. Mike, I think that's been a really good discussion. I think we're going to try and give everybody a few minutes back, because after 14 months of webinars, I think everybody's a bit zoomed out. I wonder if you've got any closing thoughts, but I just want to thank you on behalf of everybody who's here today and everybody involved with BASIS. First of all, for joining us and for so freely sharing your expertise. You say you're not an elite athlete, and I'll take your word for that, but you are elite in your field, and we do benefit an awful lot from hearing from you. And also for the work that you've done with us over a long period of time now, and hope that collaboration can continue sport by sport into the future. You know, it's a real privilege to be able to hear from you, and really thank you for your contribution today.
Thank you, Dom, and thank you, Russell and BASIS, for inviting me. It's been a real pleasure to come and chat about these things, because they are important. They're important, you know, for the future of our planet, and they're also important for the future of our elite sport, you know, from year to year. And if there's nothing else, there's a real call for sports fans to get engaged in lobbying on climate change, if only for the self-interest of them being able to see a decent level of performance and world records and national records. And there's also a call for the international federations and committees to just push the thermal considerations up the agenda when deciding on where and when to go for events and where to place them.
Yeah, absolutely right. Absolutely right. Well, thanks very much, Mike. I think we'll draw it to a close there, but we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you.
Take care.
Okay, Russell, thanks very much. Thanks, Anna.
Thank you.
Thank you,
All
Mike. Absolutely brilliant. There's so much stuff in there. I've been writing down notes, all these policy things, and almost too many questions to ask, to be honest.
That's a pleasure. And as I say, you've probably got my email address, but just drop me an email and I'll remind me. Oh yes, it's the link to Andy Smith and BASES, because that might be a profitable combination going forward. I know that they've. I mean, I've managed to get. I'm not actually BASES member, but I'm a FISSOC member, and I've managed to get them to have a climate policy in terms of what they put on at meetings, etc., and how they go about things. But I think BASES would be a good link for you as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I think I've got it. If not, I'll definitely get it from Dom, and I'll drop.
Well, let me just put it in the chat for you. Whoops.
Okay. Yeah. Perfect.
And then you get that.
Perfect. That'd be good.
Just check I spelt my name wrong. I normally get it wrong. There we go. That's right. That's got it. Okay. Thanks very much indeed.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.